Welcome everyone to Mainstream Magic, Enchantment for Everyone at the School of Occult Arts.
Yes, and this is a kind of second pass at this lecture. Originally, this lecture was given for the Portal to Ascension, but now we're folding it into the School of Occult Arts with some expanded information that's more appropriate for those of us who are magically operant as opposed to a kind of questioning audience.
Exactly. I mean, we're all questioning.
Yeah.
But some of us have a little bit more background and insight into this community. So lecturers here, Dan, Kat, and Isabel, we're all here joining you to talk about this interesting subject. So let's get into it. Okay. Magic, we've seen it become more mainstream and accessible than ever before with rapid exchange of resources and ideas online. Some thought leaders are saying that we might be living through another occult revival, and that is Mitch Horowitz. He discussed that kind of at length as it might actually be happening.
Yes.
Or even more broadly, like a more spiritual revival, as more and more people are marking that they are spiritual but not religious.
And although Mitch Horowitz made that statement some time ago, in the interim between that statement being made and this lecture, prominent chaos magicians have come forward to say that they believe this is a new golden age, as well as John Michael Greer, who claims that this is a new golden age of even ceremonial magic, something that through 2000 to 2010, most practitioners considered to be mostly dead.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
There has been a rise in the belief of astrology, growth in Wicca, acceptance of traditionally occult technology, such as pendulums and crystal healing. And we're seeing witchcraft and magic in everywhere, even more so in the past few years. We're seeing it in movies, TV, comics, books, and more, it seems. And there's even a new term that describes the phenomena of millennials and Gen Z people who are interested in the occult. It's called a culture. And that's what we'll be talking about tonight, a lot about a culture. So why is there an increase in occult interest? There are a few reasons, and we can talk about them here. There's much more access to grimoires, to old magical texts, and new magical teachings. So the internet, it disseminates information. It allows you to discuss topics with people who are across the world, and preserves that conversation so that you can view them at any time. But what's really interesting is that some of these old grimoires are just now being translated and made available to the public. We're talking about the Greek magical papyri. We're talking about things like an excellent book of the art of magic, which did not need to be translated. Well, actually it did, because Old English is very hard to read.
Yes.
But it's being printed now, and there are essays on that subject, and we can consume that. So there's just much more access.
A great deal of this work is now also in the public domain. So there has never been a point before now, historically speaking, where so much magic has been available at such an accessible price. Even some of the high-end grimoires have digital companions available for as little as $10.
Yes.
Which previously to purchase
as little as $0.
Yes, to purchase a grimoire would be an extremely expensive endeavor. Firstly, you would have to know someone. Generally, they were rare antique books that were dealt through antiquities dealers. You may not be able to purchase your antique grimoire simply because a collector of rare books has found it before you did, and they might not be interested in the magic, but they are interested in the idea of the book on their shelf. So this is a period where we now have just, I can't overestimate how much information at our fingers, which I think is something we talk about a lot or hear a lot. Like everyone, with the advent of the internet, there was this constant refrain, especially for digital natives, as opposed to people who had to learn the internet from a pre-internet age. there's always been this refrain of it's an information superhighway. There's so much access to information. And while that is all true, I think it's probably most true in the occult world.
Yeah, and that leads to our second point, like a greater exchange of ideas.
Mhm.
So we have information, we have knowledge, presumably, but we also can discuss that and talk about ideas and really work on them together, establish them together. This also shows up in kind of sharing a witchy aesthetic.
Mhm.
And I don't know about you, Isabel, but I find that like aesthetic and things like that very easy to transfer.
Oh, absolutely. And with the revival of and accessibility of these grimoires, what's really great from an art history perspective is all of the hidden artists that didn't have a platform, that weren't given precedent, or they weren't male, what have now been talked about. And a lot of the women artists of the time, and not just the surrealists, which I love, were using so many different occult methods in making their artwork. So I know some of you have listened in on the art history lecture and occult intersections, but that one, they're still discovering even today different artist books and how they're talking about a culture at that time and how they kept it in small groups. But now we're seeing that proliferated in society today because there is an audience that is very curious about those things.
Absolutely. And it's easier to find witchy tools and techniques that don't belong to one culture alone, that doesn't seem to be blocked off. And that's kind of a double-edged sword, because often tools and techniques, yes, they kind of do belong to this origin, to this culture. But at this point, many of them have been so shared without that knowledge that they've kind of just been absorbed almost through osmosis.
It becomes very easy to absorb particular entities, practices, deities, or magical philosophies without not only without like the blessing or the acknowledgement of whatever culture kind of created these ideas, but it becomes easy to absorb them without actually plugging those concepts into their lineage. So to come by something for a purely aesthetic purpose and say, I like the aesthetics of this, I will plug it into my work, without understanding the greater or broader context of what that entity, deity, or practice means within its cultural practice. And this becomes very confused, and we'll talk about it in depth a little later. But this becomes very fraught because one of the histories of magic has been this concept throughout antiquity up until today of stealing everything that's not nailed down.
I mean, just think of Egypt.
Yes.
And England's fascination with that during the pre 1800s and 1800s, and like just bringing that out, and Crowley later innovated on that.
But this goes all the way back even to an Egyptian period where the Egyptians are stealing things from the people groups they conquer, from the shared lineage. Oh, yes.
On the period
and
of time.
That's what that is definitely what we're going to express a little bit later as we talk through this. How does one plug into a magical lineage where things are stolen or whole cloth created, maybe thousands of years ago, and use them in a way that is respectful and also aware of the greater history of that work? And that's something that we're seeing come up on like places like Witch Talk, where there's conversations about what is an open and closed practice. That's how we end up with a correct take, like certain indigenous practices, like indigenous First Peoples of America or the Northern American continent, being closed, and bad takes like Christianity is a closed practice. How do we begin to separate these pieces and pull on these threads?
Exactly. And I have to say it because I'm thinking of it. It just reminds me of in the Greek magical papyri where one of the authors wrote, Hermes plagiarized this.
Yes.
That is just a lot of moxie to say an entity plagiarized something. Moving on to our final point on this slide. More and more people are finding these tools to be useful and accurate. So that's
Yes.
another reason that Magick has become more mainstream and accessible. People are seeing that it works.
Yes.
So there seems to be a cult tool, technique, or tradition from everyone from crystal moms to 5D humans to trad witches, Thelemites, chaos magicians, druids, and much more.
Yeah,
Truly.
anything in between. The great paradox of this is ultimately that mainstream magic, while being more accessible than ever, by being more open than ever, by being more practical, and perhaps even having a greater deal of materialist research behind the idea of like psi phenomena or mediumship, despite this being something that's discussed more openly, there's been a paradoxical pivot to a less profound sense of enchantment overall throughout these magical traditions and these paths. And we can talk more about that.
And yeah, just to briefly, because Dan's point was really important, I think. Yeah, there's less like enchantment when you divorce things from their stories, because it's the stories that are, provide the context, provide the meaning, often provide the symbols, and symbols being like the language in which we talk about these things and work with these things. So what we're seeing is the divorce of that and trying to it falls into then kind of a materialist paradigm, and it falls into a maybe this is, as you say, Dan, maybe this is just spicy psychology.
Yeah, I think what we end up with when we divorce magic from its lineage and the places where we've come from with it, if you are a devotee of a specific path, whether that be a somewhat deeply problematic Egyptian fetishism of a thelemic order, or a deeply held belief in like a neo-pagan reconstruction of the 1970s, like what Celtic magic is according to drawing down the moon. When we don't have that small sliver of access to a few meager sources that we hold to believe in fully, or believe that there's a greater truth behind, to draw back to that Peter Carroll equation of magic being inversely proportionate or inversely powerful in its belief, and it's the belief we have in it, that leads to less enchantment with that particular system and less power in the working of that system. And this, I think, is something we see when we find practitioners who kind of float from practice to practice. One day we're doing the Celtic Golden Dawn, one day we're chaos magicians, one day we are 5D humans.
It's me.
Yes, it is a search for that deeper coherence of an enchantment. And that, I think, is the greater term that we're losing, is coherence. So finding something that is both moving for us and powerful for us, but also coherent for us, is one of the ways in which we find a magical tradition that we can root into and see the world through. I think Danny makes a good point in the chat where she says, when we start to know something, we make it mundane. Try to keep everything as still wrapped in its mystery. And that is something that's integral to magic, is that element of mystery, the idea that we can find something more. How disappointing it becomes when we're reading, Kabbalistic magic and find out that the Rosicrucians never actually existed. And certainly we can play with a kind of, certainly we can play with a kind of dynamic here of, oh, well, there's a metaphorical existence, or there's an existence within my head. But then this quickly does bring us into a space of magic is simply like self-delusion and spicy psychology, as opposed to something that's plugged into the wall and actually has power moving through it.
Yeah, and that's kind of what we mean by enchantment here, is like effectiveness, but also like an embracing an orientation towards mystical or spiritual aspects of reality. It's kind of like tied into the ability to relate to magic and spiritual or supernatural. Jen also says something, and I want to get there. Jen, also realizing my ego is thinking it knows what's going on, when in reality, I'm barely even starting to understand.
Yes. This reminds me of a conversation we had with Isabel about the perils and optimism of virtual reality. And we were discussing our distaste for virtual reality with you, Isabel, and you said, how can we prepare to work with virtual reality when we're not yet immersed in our own lived reality? And I thought that was like such a great awareness of that, way of thinking.
Yeah, and I think speaking to, right, that I liked your metaphor of is the magic actually plugged into the wall? And I know, Danny, I've been seeing your reflections on this as well. And this is why I like to mention grimoire works or making our own book of shadows as part of our own kind of scientific method of putting the magic into practice. And I love Kat mentioning, oh, I'm trying a little bit of this, I'm trying a little bit of this. And then we get to the narrative or the lineage. And that's where the magic starts coming in, and we start integrating that. And this is why we have integration periods at SOA, because we're like, oh, wait, this is a lot, right? And doing our own research and resonating and seeing what works for us. I think that looking at all of this information superhighway, super important to take that time to integrate and practice and recultivate that magic, that enchantment, so we don't lose sight of it becoming in a culture of materialism.
Yes. And that segues perfectly into the next slide when we talk about what mainstream magic currently is, because there is a thriving world of mainstream magic that is in existence even in the corporate boardroom. I saw a magician complaining on Facebook a few days ago, well, at this point, a few months ago, good Lord, who said that it's only a matter of time before some occultist sells out and starts lecturing to boardrooms on magic. And I was quick to jump in and said, that's already happening. Like, it is already there. And it's been there for some time. The trick is that it is not presented as Aleister Crowley in flapping robes and like a sex orgy. It is instead presented as, again, this kind of thing that happens in the brain and something for productivity. If you're interested in falling down this rabbit hole a little further, I do recommend the book McMindfulness, which is a study on how mindfulness culture within businesses and within the boardrooms is essentially taking a practice out of Buddhism of meditation and awareness and being in the moment here now, but excising all of the things that actually make that tick, taking out everything that is a little bit too spiritual or a little bit too woo-woo or a little bit too culturally rooted, such as the idea of like what we're doing within our various incarnations, what we're doing within like historical caste systems and the ability to rise above or fall below them, and cutting all of that out and just saying, well, what matters is that you have a time for your brain to be quiet. And that's how you end up with Amazon having little meditation closets for the people on the factory floor, as opposed to integrated full health and wellness of their employees. You can see the way the tech is removed and put, if not to ill purpose, at least to a purpose that is drastically less effective than an integrated, fully aware, culturally oriented Buddhist meditation practice.
There's like so much that's pinging for me right now, but I'm gonna stay on task. So mainstream magic, simply put, basic popular magical techniques, as Dan was just providing a good example for, put to use by both practitioners and non-practitioners and beginner occultists. So all.
Yeah.
So this pop
Mhm.
magic is less about having and using specialized occult knowledge and more about having the merch, having the aesthetic.
Having the
Mhm.
million decks of tarot cards, some with cats, some with coffee
Which
beans,
we love.
which we do love to see, but also noting when a practitioner's practice becomes purely a collection as opposed to an integrated practice. Like, what is the tarot deck telling us? Or are we just getting a dopamine hit by buying another tarot card deck? And I know
And
that
I think
dopamine hit is not correct,
It's
but
beautiful.
I think so too. I think that it's that dance, right? Of the both can coexist. And when we're noticing, ooh, there's another deck, or here's the
Mhm.
pre-order, right? Being like,
Mhm.
oh, wait a second, let's check in. Is this
Mhm.
part of my magical workings? Did we make space for this? Like, let me check my pile of other decks.
Mhm. Yeah,
Absolutely.
I'm oh, I will let Kat go here. I have another thing, but we will
Okay.
stick to our outline.
God help us, God's help us, we'll stick to it. But Danny has a comment.
Yes.
Danny said, it's like how we use quantum physics for electronics, but we refuse to discuss the actual truth or implications of what that quantum reality means.
Yes. This is my personal
Yes.
pet peeve.
Good.
One of my many. But yes, how many people do we find on, again, the internet world explaining I'm distracted by Danny saying I'm studying for my deck with all these decks. I love it because I've been there and I am there.
Yes. Yes.
Too good.
Mhm.
I'm sorry, Dan.
It's so
Quantum
good.
physics.
Yeah. So how often do we see practitioners, even within a magical framework, just kind of explaining, expressing ideas about quantum reality that are not in any way grounded in the science, the materialist science of quantum reality or quantum theory, and ending up then again, we find the ways in which we end up in these weird cul-de-sacs of there's a great deal of discourse currently around the idea of hyperconsumption, hypercapitalism, conspiracy theory, and 5D reality crystal people. And what I believe starts with very good intentions around trying to find a coherent framework for magic, but then finding that the work of that coherent framework is easily supplanted by instead buying magical looking things, and then ending up in places that don't match that quantum reality or quantum theory, but explaining them as if they do. This is a particular sticking point in most magic, and it's not limited to that kind of quantum realm. If you look back through history, it's repeated in the idea of ether. It is how so many Golden Dawn ceremonial magicians ended up just being horrible imperialists with very bad takes on almost everything.
You start there, you end there.
Yeah, it is the main thing that we're striving for when we embark on a magical journey is a search for a type of coherence that's both internal and then reflected externally. And that is the journey. Like, that is the great work of self-transformation, is like, what is this coherent lens for me to view and interact reality?
You are going off.
Sorry.
That is too much. Number one, Danny is an agent of chaos.
Yes.
Number two, I think it's these kinds of concepts are explored really well still and always in science fiction.
Yes, Isabel sums it up really well here. With losing coherence ends up with clinical material working that then can be used for negative political reasons or even social ones.
Yeah.
Obvious example, QAnon.
We all know what the merch is.
Yes.
We've seen it. We have either wanted to buy it or we have cringed or both. So witchy makeup kits, witch subscription boxes, crystal-based fragrances, moon dust juices, and more, all things that I looked up and found. And then things like corporate mindfulness, as Dan mentioned at the beginning of the slide, biohacking.
Yes, which
Yeah.
tends to sometimes fall outside the purview of like what magicians think magic is. But again, this is a hyper materialist enchantment. This looks very much like, in my opinion, the apotheosis of chaos magic. It is a reality and a framework which denies the existence of anything spiritual or mental, and instead looks at the body as a machine or engine that can be fine-tuned and automated through processes that are sometimes very occult, like orgone therapy, or crystal healing sometimes even shows up here. But it will never be called crystal healing. It would instead be like alkaline water consumption, mineral water infusions, these things that are very much, we're using the crystals, we're using these energetic like material structures for health and for consciousness.
Okay, and let's do a quick definition. Biohacking is kind of an expression of using cutting edge, often unproven, to some degree, scientific research to get greater control over their bodies and lifestyles. And often we see things like using grounding mets and magnet healing and things like that. But also it goes up to like, you know, kind of being a cyborg.
Yes.
Integrating with like machinery, basically.
The end result is ultimately transhumanism here, which has horrifying implications for the occultist, but it also is a real world enchantment that some of the most prominent currently today, some of the most prominent technologists are very much interested in, from Gates to Musk to Zuckerberg.
Oh, the big three.
The big three.
The triumvirate.
Yes.
Well, if anything, the biohackers are if we were to mirror back from our alchemy lecture, trying to defy death, right? So they're going back to that. So we have cryogenics, we have all these other surgeries where you can implant different technologies. I mean, and there's good and bad with that, because that helps so many different people in many ways. However, I don't know if you need to open your car with a magnet implanted in your hand, right? Like
Yes.
Right.
Like
it is magical, but like
don't lose everything at the service of greater perceived control.
Exactly.
Yes.
There's also something here where if we follow, like, again, because this is hyper materialist, hyper technologist kind of space, there is a tendency within the kind of pop culture discourse, like if you're looking at Forbes or Technologist or these various websites or Wired magazines, etc., they tend to present this as like something purely scientific. However, as we begin to kind of peel back the layers of who's at the forefront of biohacking, we find some of the same like fraught eugenicists that we find in some of the more unsavory occultic material as well. I was most recently thinking about the Georgia Guidestones being destroyed. And the Georgia Guidestones, for those of you who don't know, are like 5 stones which have inscriptions on them about like how to essentially restart humanity. They are mysteriously placed there, and for a long time no one knew who put them there. Earlier this summer they were like destroyed, most likely by someone, we still don't know who destroyed them, but based off of various social media like Facebook groups, it seems like a pretty like right-wing Christian organization who destroyed them for fear that they were like satanic. There's a really good documentary and some investigative journalism on who actually commissioned the creation of those Guidestones. And that individual was, surprise, kind of crazy racist eugenicist dude who actually somehow had more in common with the people who likely blew up the Guidestones than they would think from the outset. And yet the same type of individual, these same kind of thought groups are so unmoored from a kind of collective like spirituality or a non-materialist paradigm that we can end up in some pretty fraught places. So it is something to sit with, to think about, to understand where these ideas are coming from.
A lot to say on that, and we'll probably do an occult tech
We will do an occult.
Yeah.
for this coming semester because there is so much to say.
Oh yes, because
Mhm.
as goofy as we think sometimes some biohacking things can be, like cryogenics,
Oh, God.
we can also end up in really strange occult places like orgone and
Sensory
Yeah.
deprivation chambers.
Yes.
I've always wanted to do that.
what was the
Mhm.
other the
What?
it's like sensory deprivation, but it limits any electromagnetic field.
Faraday.
Yeah, a Faraday cage.
Oh,
The
yeah.
effects of Faraday cages on psychics and remote viewers within psychic and remote viewing
Okay,
studies.
we have to stop. We have to move on. Or otherwise we're gonna like stick on biohacking forever.
I know.
Anyway, Dan, I have done it.
Yes.
Did it on their wedding day.
Yeah, it was
That's
worth
all.
it.
That's
Okay.
No longer available. Anyway. Barnes and Noble chain bookstore occult reading. This is,
Mhm.
I mean, again, it's kind of a double-edged thing. Like I love to see it. I do.
I love to see entry points for people.
Yes, I mean, I bought a book from Barnes and Noble that changed my life. It was Robin Wall Kimmerer's book, Braiding Sweetgrass,
Mhm.
and it
Mhm.
ignited a desire in me to find like whatever in my lineage was indigenous, whatever was more animist, and I went from there to druidry, and then made quite a wild leap into chaos magic. So like we love to see it. But
Mhm.
there's also like a lot of beginner texts just don't cover it, and some of them are filled with, not filled with, but have things that kind of misrepresent
Yes.
magic.
I wouldn't say friends, but I have a professional relationship with Richard Webster, who, for those of you who don't know, Richard is the most published occult author of Llewellyn's. He has the most books published for Llewellyn's, and he's written some very excellent books,
Yes.
many intro to
100%.
pendulums, intro to palm reading. And there was a particular conversation with Richard where he pointed out that he's been trying to write more advanced magical texts for, at this point,
Mhm.
over a decade. And Llewellyn's publishing has come out and said, we do not want more advanced texts because no one buys them. Please keep writing intro level things. And that publishing is not limited to just Llewellyn's. Like, I'm not calling them out here. Wiser, many of the big occult publishing companies that have deals with chain bookstores like Barnes and Noble, or years ago Borders or BAM, they have a direct vested interest in introductory level text, which is excellent, but also problematic in that there is no place to advance. And so it does facilitate or even encourage practitioners who are looking for new avenues, looking for new places to go, rather than moving deeper into their work, just being kind of bumped around from intro level to intro level.
Mhm.
I think
Jennifer says, is it a lack of interest or fear of the public gaining that knowledge?
Ooh.
I think there are multiple considerations at play. One is the pure economics of it, because anyone who's interested in witchcraft or in occultism is interested in starting, right? Like anything that they can learn. And we've all gone through that phase, I'm certain, of buying hundreds of dollars worth of like introductory level books, cashing that paycheck and buying more books.
there will always be more introductory level people in any field than the expert level.
But I think that there's also a component at play that some of this material is very difficult. Some of the material needs to be understood through its proper like social and historical framework and point of its origin in publishing. some of those pieces are very difficult to publish or to gain access to.
Yeah.
Thelema in particular is very tricky. Whoever currently holds the reins on Thelemic publishing is
Text.
very careful about which books they allow to be published, which letters from Crowley, Parsons, Hubbard, etc., that they allow out for public consumption. Part of that is a grade system. Part of that is that some of those letters and texts are unflattering, maybe even more so given current like social climate. Aleister Crowley was a controversial figure in his time and remains even more of a controversial figure today. To put it lightly.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I know Isabel has things to say on the next topic, which
Yes.
is manifestation YouTube channels.
Yes. Oh, we've had so many conversations on this.
We
Right,
share videos
yeah.
with each other.
This goes back to the introduction level, right? Of, well, I want a quick fix, right? Or the McMindfulness thing. And I think this has something to do with more kind of Western culture also, and the climates that be, with a constant crisis, with a pandemic, with things like, I need something quick, right?
Mhm.
And as we know, the deeper we get into past introductory level, the more internal shadowy things emerge, the more we realize, oh, wow, I need therapy, right? Like all these other angles come in, and then we get resistance. And so with YouTube manifestation videos, it's again, that introductory level kind of practice. And you can see like it's a dime a dozen, right? You can
Yes.
just search manifestation and they're all going to be the same flavor. And actually, like the other day I sent Kat and Dan this really cool, I thought it was a cool course on ancestry and some other things. And then I checked the material, and it's again that kind of sugary, syrupy, watered down material that I'm like, oh, come on, guys, let's go deeper. Let's go deeper. But I find this too, to kind of echo back on the introductory books and things like that, is the deeper you go down, the more intricate and personal it also becomes. So how do you make that personal universal? And this is why we study different grimoires. We experiment with different things, because what may work for one person may not work for another. And then we add astrology on top of that, and everyone's personal astrology, their own lineages, and we get layers of things. So
yeah. That's really like ultimately the failure of the grade systems. As much as I will die on the hill that I love the aesthetics of ceremonial magic, the grade system's failure was that it did not account for the personal integration and the personal gnosis that is achieved when someone's doing magic. This is ultimately why Thelema kind of stumbles with Jack Parsons gaining his own kind of acclaimed personal gnosis, because through the grade system, all that it is in magic is what's revealed. As soon as you have another Enochian entity or Babylon figure coming and saying, well, actually, it's not the highest graded individual within the order, it's this guy or this woman or this person, the whole system kind of falls apart and it's no longer useful. This is why Parsons ended up writing We Are the Witchcraft, and why he became as fascinated with witchcraft towards the end of his life, because witchcraft has, for its greater history, not surrendered the hyper-personal journey of the practitioner, where the over-organized kind of industrial magic of the grade systems denies that.
Yeah. And I think this goes also with the, when speaking to mindfulness and how we take this clinical material away from the enchantment, we're seeing this rise in secularism and an awayness from traditional religious structures and maybe even grading systems in a way. So now there is this search for enchantment, but it's still secularized. And how do we put that on a mass scale? So lots to think about.
And to build on that, and I would want Kat and Isabel's opinion on this too. I think like the reason, not the entire reason, but one of the reasons that there might be a move within magical communities towards secularization or a fear of embracing with tradition is exactly that. It is a cultural, religious, and spiritual interaction to which I am not a part of. And that doesn't necessarily mean that we should avoid it. I think something's definitely lost when we say like, oh, I'll just do Catholic Spanish folk magic without being from Spain or doing, Spanish folk customs or attending mass. I'll just take this thing I like. I do like Gordon's approach where he brings up the idea of staying with the trouble. Like just because this is trouble doesn't mean that we can't stay with it. And that's Donna Haraway. Yes, thank you.
That is attributed, and he's attributed to Donna Haraway correctly, but sometimes we forget who these ideas belong to.
Thank you for reminding us.
But we have posted an essay from Donna Haraway in the Great Hall. So if you want to search that in the group afterwards, or just look up her essays for free. Yeah, she talks about like she talks specifically about staying with the trouble of this world and how humans interact with it and how we are treating it, but how we can't help but be in relationship with these things and really continuing on with the problem and not just saying we're gonna like fly to the moon.
Yeah.
And just forget it, fly to the moon.
Right. Well, I think that's why also the Hierophant in tarot is so important, right? There's the physical journey, right? And the Hierophant is part of that, then the mental journey that the Fool goes on, and then finally at the end, the metaphysical. And you need all three, right? And this is where we get into trouble, or we, accidentally blow ourselves up, right?
Yeah.
We forget the body, we forget where the origins come from. And I think this is why when we are talking about different lectures at SOA, bringing the lineages and bringing the historical contexts are part of that Hierophant type of energy. It gives credit where credit is due, and I think that's very important, not even just like physical from a metaphorical physical perspective, but as a learning practice in general, or as a value in general, so we don't lose ourselves.
Yeah,
absolutely. Taking the whole of the plant medicine, not just extract.
Yes,
exactly.
Exactly.
Okay, we can't get away from this.
I've been trying to put it off.
You were.
That's why I've been talking about, everyone has these good points, and I'm like, I don't want to get to this next one.
Well, we can't talk about mainstream magic without talking about witch talk.
Right.
So this is a community that, as of last month, had 28.4 billion views, which is, pretty high for a subgroup of TikTok. And it was like written about a couple years ago at this point.
For a period of time, it was the most viewed subgroup of TikTok as an app.
Right. Oh, and that's incredible.
Yes.
Like, because it's global, obviously. And so there is still a lot going on Witch Talk, as you probably know. It's a basis for magic discourse and education on an app that is fed by controversy, canceling, and making people feel highly negative emotions. Positive too, but a lot of that as well. But so lots of how-to videos, ambiance, aesthetic videos, readings for communities, and commentary on magic and how it works and what we think of it. And currently it's kind of a community full of gatekeeping and backbiting and again, issues of misinformation.
Yes. Most famously, I think was a year or 2 years ago when Witch Talk hexed the moon, which was a collective decision that left a lot of individuals saying, what is happening on this app? However, when you are involved with the app and when we're involved in the community and when we view it with a little bit of grace as opposed to being like, oh, well, we are the occultists who know all and isn't this silly, you can see very easily how individuals who are interested in doing magic, and again, we all do this, do weird stuff and make mistakes. Like one of my favorite things about magic was some of the mistakes I made early on, thinking that I could just skip ahead to the back of the book and do the fun stuff. And the weirdness that wrought and the strangeness, and yes, certainly sometimes the discomfort. When one practitioner is doing that, there is something relevant to the journey of the practitioner. However, when we're in a community that amplifies by billions of views and thousands of active participants, then things become a little bit more amplified, a little bit more powerful, and perhaps maybe a little bit more dangerous. Maybe not physically so, but certainly to the psyche. And I think that's something you can see clearly on Witch Talk, is that there is the energy is sometimes really bad.
Vibes aren't good, y'all. It's also like the place where people have discourse about things that are relevant, but also about things like ethics in the magic world. And it's hard to have a discourse with, short videos and not really being able to talk, face to face to the other person. It's hard to have that conversation in a nuanced way. So it's easier to kind of stick with like black and white, saying the other person is wrong or things like that.
Right. And the algorithms are built for those more controversial type of binary thinking phrases that will get views, right? And this is the perfect, again, funnel of, okay, get the big catchphrase, the controversial phrase. And if there is a live dialogue between two people that actually gets to the nuance, the people that will actually sit through that, by that time will be much less than the big, oh my gosh, what did they say moment, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Exactly. That's everywhere. That's not just magic. Many of the things we discuss in the slide, it's not exclusive to the witchy community. It's very characteristic of many communities, especially in the West, quote unquote West.
Yes, there's a clear line of observation here too. All of these things are linked by a sort of fundamental materialism of the spaces in which they're being worked, produced, discussed, etc. Mainstream magic is a good thing. I am happy that magic is mainstream. However, mainstream magic is also limited by what is currently mainstream and what is defined by acceptable and what is defined by unacceptable to the mainstream. And that is particularly evident in its obsession with a sort of provable scientific materialism that feels very safe, feels very secure, feels very grounded, especially for intro level practitioners, individuals who don't want to come across as disconnected from reality, because we have seen those individuals. I'm sure anyone listening to this lecture has remembered an encounter in an online or physical space with someone who talks about doing magic and then describes something which sounds so divorced from the framework of reality that you don't want to talk to that person again. There is a real fascination with magic as a science that has just not been proven or understood yet, as opposed to viewing magic as an art with a complementary scientific modality behind it.
And that is like personal experimentation.
Personal experimentation, keeping a book of shadows, keeping a grimoire, finding out what works for you, but never really coming to a total place of self-belief that one day a scientist will just discover that your magical workings were secretly, some unlocked piece of quantum physics, right? That we forget these things are very individuated. They are very much an individual piece. And as Kat brought up with the discussion of ethics, ethics is, one of those things that's very difficult to discuss from a purely materialist framework. We need some sort of spiritual engagement. We need some sort of philosophical engagement to understand ethics, as opposed to simply the number of atoms that make up a certain situation.
Oh. Atoms, ATOM or ADAM?
Well, from a Gnostic perspective, the number of atoms, ADAMS, is actually perfect. So let's keep going. I love it.
What does that even mean?
So,
wow, we really went down.
we went down a rabbit hole, but
there.
so where we're kind of turning towards here is now this magic connected with metaphysics and spiritual origins. This is something that we need to cultivate within mainstream magic. And our job as practitioners who explore magic in a way that is, I would argue, most ethical, is to find a way to synthesize what we are doing, the spiritual work we're undertaking for the self, with that greater understanding of metaphysics and the origins of where these things come from. If we're connected to our origins, witch talk would not be hexing the moon. We've already covered how mainstream magic often leads to confusion about what is or is not dangerous. There's a lack of complexity in addressing gray topics, of which magic has plenty.
Yeah, I mean, just thinking about like hexing, malefica.
Yes.
Anything under the terms of black magic, and certainly like gray topics like how do you do shadow work safely? Things like that.
How can you help others to do shadow work? That's a whole other.
Are you allowed?
Are you allowed to? If you're not a therapist, can you help someone else do shadow work? Do therapists have a monopoly on who can help other people?
I just want to say that as a teenager in the bathroom by myself late at night working through some stuff, I could have used some help with my shadow work.
There's also this idea of the rules of engagement, right? Like with spirits without context. So engaging with ancestors, angels, demons, or entities, or literally any spirit. This is something that came up on Witch Talk around the period of when #MeToo was like at its zenith on the app, was the conversation around, well, if we're treating others with consent and getting consent, if we extrapolate that into a space of, working the Lesser Key of Solomon or some of these ancient grimoires, do we need a demon, angel, entity's consent to do a working? Should we bind them? Should we take their word when they tell us something as their word? And that was an interesting ethical conversation, but one which historically has been a point of contention, one which historically has been very much understanding that the rules of engagement may be slightly different with an angelic entity than with your fellow human.
With a demon.
And what do you feel when you do that? Like, if you as the magical worker is saying, like, I'm now going to essentially, and I don't like to use terms out of their context, but essentially gaslight a demon when it tells me, is that wrong? Should I feel bad about that? Like, is that unethical? From a place of just a purely like, we respect other beings and life, we respect other life, perhaps not, but from a space of, the corpus of these grimoire works, we don't know what happens if we don't, right? Or do we want to take that chance? These are like this kind of sticky questions, especially when the demon might be gaslighting us.
Oh my gosh, yes. I deserved, I suppose, but like, this is very much important. It's an important question to magic as a whole, because what is doing magic? Is any magic really consensual? I mean, yes.
Or is it?
Well, I mean, thinking of like that, like self-blessing magic,
Self-blessing,
like
sure.
But if you're gonna like do
a love spell's the obvious example.
A love spell, yeah, absolutely. Not very much about control, very much generally non-consensual because it is forcing feelings.
But this is why I
Mhm.
like to talk here with you, particularly about Malefica,
Okay.
because so many practitioners have an aversion to Malefica
Yeah.
and say, like, we can't do that. That's not in my tradition. That is bad.
Mm.
So far to the point where, like, the Wiccan Rede is very
It'll
much
come
like,
back on you.
you'll come back on you if you do bad things, if you do Malefica.
Sure.
And yet, historically, when we look at the umbrella of what Malefica is, protection magic, reversal spells, these
Yes.
things are considered Malefica
That's true.
because they interfere with another individual's will.
Yes.
And by
That's the
protecting
best
you,
example, yeah.
you are in fact putting that energy, that
Yeah.
will, that alignment
are-
on someone else.
We're no longer allowing them to hurt you.
Mm.
Mhm.
But those are the finer details.
And these are the books that should be published.
Yeah.
Okay. Magic without context or metaphysics is lacking the ability to recognize religious, spiritual experiences and address the supernormal. Because we're taking everything at a personal level, at a lack of tradition, a lack of recognition. What's the word? Recognition of like folk tales and things
Yes.
like that. We're kind of left without a guidepost, without guidance moving forward in how do we interpret these things that happen. That there are a lot of commonalities throughout, I guess, since the cave drawings in the Lascaux cave.
Yeah.
In France. Like, what is like an initiatory experience? What is a shamanic experience? Well, like there is evidence to suggest that it's very similar across cultures and across time. If you have a shamanic experience, if you have an initiatory experience that's really powerful like that, and you don't know that, it can leave you disconnected, it can leave you frightened, and it can leave you like
feeling entirely without agency.
Yes.
I do have a question here for Isabel and Kat as well that I've been thinking about over the past few days, which is the idea. I was thinking about this within the context of Christianity. When you look to Old Testament and New Testament texts specifically, we won't get into the extra biblical texts because they're interesting, but they're a whole conversation.
We're just exploring canon right now.
Yes, exploring canon. We see other gods, other entities, other practitioners, other magicians doing things, right? And the magicians who do miracles for God, I gave myself away. The magicians who do magic for God in the Bible, the joke is, well, that's just, they just call that miracles within church. But if it's someone else doing a miracle, then it's magic and it's bad. So my question here is the practice of magic for the magician at some level the practice of some other group's religion from the outside?
What is religion?
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah, because we will see that in especially the Old Testament of different groups and that. And this goes back to thinking about, not to bring it back to witch talk as we explore canon.
Yeah.
But right, like how do you manage 12 billion views, right? Maybe I don't know how many people that may be, versus a smaller tribe in the Old Testament that had a set agreed upon value system, right? And as we were talking about ethics, like, oh, that's such an important thing to have as a foundation of your practice of deciding what are my values, what are my ethics, because there are going to be some practices all across the world that is a non-issue, right? For me, like I will not ask for consent from these deities, or I will this is where I retain my sovereignty, and this is where I offer humility, right? So I think that if I'm going to look at the work of Mircea Eliade and looking across the world about shamans and also magicians and magical practices, I think that each each tribe and group had an element or a person or a group of people that did engage with magic at some point as the healer, as the storyteller, as the wisdom keeper, right? That would honor all of that wisdom throughout lineages and then engage with magic from that culture of that tribe, right? And that culture was an agreed upon ethics and how we engage with magic. And that's why I think, again, back to the historical points, how important that is to connect with personal lineages as well.
That's a great point.
If that answered the question.
I mean, how can you? But I think along that question as well, like everyone, maybe this is a bit of sidestep, but you know,
So much of magic is a
like to
sidestep.
dance, you know. You all have a paradigm. We all have a paradigm. Some of us switch between many. A worldview that we stick to, a philosophy often. We have various philosophies, and many of us have various religions without, you know, necessarily
identifying them as such.
Yeah.
Yes, or being explicit with them.
And being explicit, yeah. So I think that it is natural to do so. And if magic is practicing religions that may or may not be our own, I mean, I think it's just working with thought.
Yeah, I think it demystifies the idea of magic as the idea of magic as its own thing. The idea that magic is somehow something perfectly preserved and untainted or totally pure, and instead turns magic into something that is a intermingling of many different ideas and evolutions of those ideas over time.
Yeah, it could be that evolution of a particular thought or thought system, Kat.
Oh, wow. That paints us in a very positive light. So
it does, doesn't
it? We'll say that's our final answer.
Yes. I do also want to point out, Danny in the chat says, I think religious magic equals working with the powers that be, where witchcraft in the religious context is forcing the powers that be. I think there's shades of that for sure. But even within the, like, if we're talking here about like a religious, Christian religious tradition, there is also a shade of forcing the powers that be occasionally.
Yourself.
You're forcing yourself.
You're denying yourself.
I think you can look to some of the faith healers here for a great example of this, where a lot of faith healers refer to this idea that something merely needs to be claimed in God's name, and God is compelled as an action to respond to that.
I mean, that's how much of a demonology is.
Yes.
And Ancient Grimoire is an excellent book. Is this compelling in the name of God?
Yes. And compelling, this is where things we'll talk about this in Angel Magic too, tipping my hand here. But the idea for the mystic Judaism, the idea of fallen angels as essentially when these fallen or these angelic entities that were not so aligned with the idea of remaining in a kind of cosmic space came into physical form, they took the form of plants or of stones and acted as teachers, which is a really, I thought, interesting, like kind of cross-cultural mapping when you look at some like shamanistic traditions or indigenous traditions where the plants have spirit that literally teach us things. Those entities are still also compelled, even within the overarching structure of what is, allowed or what is permitted.
I love that idea.
Yes.
Jen has an interesting comment. If you think about it, though, Christianity appropriated pagan rituals. Where does originality stop and appropriation begin with any of this?
Ooh,
Rituals.
I know. What a fabulous question.
Yes.
We discussed this a little bit, not enough, not as much as I'd love to, in the Christianity and the occult lecture. It's like there was swapping, there was natural evolution, there was cooperation. There was going to church on Sunday and working with the devil on Saturday.
Yeah, I want to see if I can find it while we react to this, because I think it's important. There's a Portuguese magician, and I want to point out specifically his name and if he has a book out recently.
Okay, he's doing some quick.
Yeah, I'm doing some quick Googling here.
This has never happened before.
Yes, it's never happened before.
First time for an SOA.
Because
lecture.
this is something that's spoken about within the idea of like a Catholicism, and Jose Leotao. He has a really great book on the devil and saints.
No.
And he talks in that lecture and that book about the idea of a Catholic church. Now, Portugal being a Catholic, a state religion that is Catholic, this idea of a universal Catholic church that is, you know, the religious body governed by the Vatican, and then the cultural Catholicism. And the way in which the cultural Catholicism of Portugal has the folk saints and the folk holy days and working with the devil on Saturday and going to church on Sunday, as Kat said, that is in many ways something that supersedes the priest-like class. And the analogy he gives is that, you know, Granny, who's making an offering to the devil to heal someone in her community, she knows that the priest, let's say Carlos, the priest in the community, doesn't like that. However, she raised Carlos. She remembers when he was like a 5-year-old little boy. And so the weight that she places on the kind of lecture from Carlos on Sunday or within the confessional is far less than the weight of healing the community. And I think that's a really like powerful way of reframing some of these traditions that we look at as purely religious and fraught and appropriative, like Catholicism or Protestant Christianity, or even to a lesser sense in the United States, but possibly equal sense within like some Eastern or global countries like Islam. This idea of the folk religion or the folk traditions, recognizing that like superseding kind of appropriative or dominant cultural force, but still keeping their customs, still keeping their beliefs, and providing a kind of different weight to them. It's something that does take some time.
Jen's done a project on this.
Yes, I think so.
Yes.
Yeah, Italian Magick would be a perfect example of this, because technically the Catholic Church, like the Vatican, denies that Saint Cyprian exists. Like Saint Cyprian was not a real saint, and we don't have a patron saint of sorcerers within the Catholic Church. However, all of Portugal uses and appeals to Saint Cyprian, and many magicians have used Saint Cyprian as a go-between or fetch to reach spirits of the dead and departed. And Saint Cyprian shows up, whether he was he
has a grimoire,
embodied, ensouled human being who was a saint, or whether he's a type of thought form. It's a really interesting question when we talk about the way in which like these spiritual traditions reflexively appropriates or quash or absorb the traditions they run up against, and the living component of those traditions that survives underneath, perhaps in a more vibrant way than the dominant tradition does. A great example to that point would be in Protestant America. The Southern Baptist Convention does not like faith healing, does not like charismatic, expressions of religiosity. And yet, throughout all of Southern Appalachia, faith healing and charismatic expressions of religion are the dominant mode, even within the Southern Baptist churches. So in many ways, those folk traditions never die and are more real than a bunch of dudes sitting in a headquarters of the Southern Baptist Convention or a bunch of guys sitting in the Vatican.
It's too good. It just reminds me of languages. We need to preserve them.
Yes.
And it's sad that you could go on the Wikipedia and be like, oh, what languages have died out today?
Yes.
But this folk knowledge, this practice, like there is a real calling for the witch, for the magician, for the practitioner to preserve them.
Yes.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And that's one of the things that heartens me most about witch talk, since we spent so much time kind of dunking on witch talk. One of the things that I like so much is seeing, because I come from an Appalachian background and Pennsylvania Dutch is my background, and Pennsylvania Dutch is a dying language and a dying, Achternaavonst is a dying magical tradition. It's been so exciting to see younger practitioners find their like rediscover this magic, rediscover long lost friend, rediscover Appalachian herbalism, rediscover not deer, these kinds of like things which were at one time the way life was experienced, but rediscover them through that app. That's been fun. Okay, and then yes, so then to build on that, Jen says there's also the thought that the Catholic Church appropriated folk customs to make them a part of the church. That is very much correct. So to me, it's like folk magic, but with extra patriarchal rules and control. Yes, and that is true. Fortunately,
absolutely
depend upon the church and their church leaders.
Yes, fortunately, there is some. It's sometimes quite easy to find where that overlap occurs. So it's the folk traditions are some, I won't say they're easy to separate, but certainly in some traditions, it's easier to find where, like in this example, the Catholic Church kind of just says, oh, well, now this is part of us. The best example is probably Bridget. In Ireland, Saint Bridget. There was no human named Saint Bridget. There was no human named Bridget. There was definitely a goddess worship of Bridget in Ireland. It's pretty easy there to see that both historically and in the function of the feast day, and recognize what the practitioners basically paid lip service to keep their functional folk tradition going. But then in other places, it is more complicated. And I would also point out that there are some places where the folk traditions appropriate, and it's difficult to use this term, where the folk traditions integrate the overarching force here being Catholicism for their own magical ends. One of my favorites is in The Devil's Dozen, here out of Wales, with the idea of, in order to enchant a talisman to work with the devil, you need to sneak it underneath the altar cloth on the altar before the priest does the transubstantiation of the bread and wine. So you see the ways in which not only are these folk traditions somewhat buried within the church, but sometimes the folk tradition is actively taking advantage of the church to receive its magical working.
I mean, like when we take holy water.
It's we go up to Saint, well, I won't say the name of it because we live here, but we go up to the local churches,
Catholic,
and
church.
I will take the holy water for my own magical workings. And sometimes even the graveyard dirt for my own magical workings. And the spirits of the space and I have a understanding. We've worked it out. And also, Jen says, I give you a Catholic pass. Perfect. Thank you. But also I have, I was a Catholic convert. And so I feel as though, and someone can take me to task for this if they like, but I feel as though I have suitably integrated myself into a tradition to the point where, according to the Roman Catholic Church and the Vatican, Dan Eckert is a good Catholic boy, that I understand the context of what I'm doing. And I'm not going to call on Mary for like a sex magic working, but I will still definitely call on Mary for some you know, for some help with something that Mary would be appropriate for.
We did do the work, Jen. We
Yeah.
did the whole conversion. We did the pre-Cana.
Pre-Cana, that's a
wild.
story. We wait to go live and talk about that fun work.
I think a story time is due.
Yeah.
We respect.
Yeah, respect.
Technically, we're just very wayward.
Technically, we're extremely wayward Catholics, like the best Catholics, I will say.
Oh, true. We
Okay,
really do
continuing
have
on.
What are we talking about tonight?
All right.
Okay.
So, trying to win at materialism, to bring us back here. This is something which we need to investigate and continue talking about within the work of magical craft, which is essentially capitulating to materialist philosophy at the expense of what is helpful, medicinal, and important about magic or the craft of magic. Trying to essentially convince a, what's his name? He's the astronomer who debates like the Ken Ham guy all the time.
I know.
He was in Batman versus Superman: Dawn of Justice.
Oh my gosh.
Tyson, something Tyson.
No, it's not.
Oh, Neil deGrasse Tyson.
Neil deGrasse
Yes.
Tyson, yes.
Okay,
Trying to
sorry.
convince Neil deGrasse Tyson or James Randi that psi phenomena is real is a losing battle. It is not helpful to either party. And ultimately, it's not going to, not only is it not persuasive, it's not going to affect your magical workings either way. To attempt to get to borrow Jen's quote earlier, to get a pass from Bill Nye the Science Guy on the magic that we're doing is not going to make our magic more effective.
No.
Unfortunately, the dominant of materialism and the dominant of witchcraft are in two distinct modes at the moment. And I don't like to think of them as being at odds, because being at odds is an unfortunate way of representing this.
Disagree.
And Kat disagrees. But I will say that
Is
they run concurrently, that the dominant of materialism is instructive and helpful, and the historical working of materialism has done a great deal of good for magic in terms of deconstruction. For example, we know things historically about the Rosicrucians or the pyramids, or what the Greeks believed, or what what the evolution of the Chinese traditional Chinese medicine is. That is helpful.
That's just how you know things. That's
Okay.
epistemology.
It's epistemology.
That's not
Okay.
materialism.
Okay.
And then you have other and whatever.
See, I'm trying to be
I'm
charitable.
getting in the weeds. But there's also like an important theory of witchcraft, theory of how you practice, that it's always meant to be opposing some greater structure in power that might be actively at present kind of creating a kind of hegemony of idea, kind of overpowering other modes of thinking, or might in the future do so. So witchcraft is always going to be standing kind of on the outside of the power structure.
That is a good approximation, a good point. I think that's the superior point. Isabel, what do you think?
What's your point, Jen?
I think historically and archetypally, the witch was always on the outside of the systems of materialism. However, this goes back to the personal, like even during the witch trials and the genocides that happened, they were using materialism for, I'm thinking particularly of midwives and herbalists and magicians of, like we said, different tribes and groups that were the recorders of, they were the book of shadow makers that documented different rituals, rites, initiations, and the tools and material things that were necessary for those rituals. So I feel like it's a macrocosm and a microcosm situation, right? Because I even just like trying to win at materialism, I think if that is the scope of the working, right, or the spell, then there are ways about to do it. I think just for the original question, it's a both and, my non-answer both and situations. But that, I feel like it's the closest to the truth that I can get, with a historical kind of context sprinkled in there.
Yes. And I think Jen brings up a good point here. That is,
now you
yeah. Jen brings up a good point here in the chat. She says, what do you mean by materialism versus non-materialism, and where does manifestation fall there regarding the second bullet point? That is a great question, and we should probably define these terms a little more strongly.
Materialism is a philosophy.
Yes, so materialism would be, or a materialist philosophy would be one rooted in essentially what is observable or what is measurable. These things are the only truth which we can know. So this is
well, it's also the fabric.
Think like
yes,
Richard Dawkins, Neil deGrasse Tyson energy.
Yes. The enchantment, go ahead.
The world is primarily made up of tangible things that we can see and interact with, and that is how we know it.
Yes. And our space is, or the space that we take up within that framework is one that is infinitesimally small and inconsequential. And that is an enchantment. I will say, like, that is an enchantment. And you see it most clearly with the ways in which people are interacting with the most recent stills, not from the Hubbard, but from the
Webb.
Yes.
What?
The Webb telescope.
Yes.
And looking at the vastness of the universe and being in awe of how expansive and massive and endless it is, and how tiny and small that we are within inside of it. That is an enchantment, and it can be a useful one. Where materialism begins to kind of, as a philosophy, begins to fall apart, at least from a magical perspective, is the lack of anything inspirited leads to ethical questions, which can only be resolved, again, as I said earlier in the lecture, by the amount of atoms which are in a room. So the amount of atomic loss or the amount of atomic gain, the amount of resources shared or resources taken, it is not necessarily zero sum
game,
but it definitely lacks a mode of being in right relation, because the way in which we end up in an ethically good space within materialism is essentially that we leave a better place we leave a better place for like our future progeny, or at least one that is imminently survivable, for the expansion of that progeny, so that people can go to Mars and then leave the solar system when it experiences heat death and hopefully go somewhere else. It is a kind of like an exponential multiplier of humans for the sake of exploring and seeing and knowing. It lacks then a sense of relation where, in an animist model or a magical model, if plants have spirits or animals have being, or our ancestry has being that can still speak with us and engage with us, the ethical mode and the reasons we do what we do changes, because it's really hard to justify the destruction of an ocean when all of the fish and plants and even the ocean itself has being. Sentience, agency, with the end result being like, oh, well, it's okay because we can just go to another planet.
Okay. All this is a very, very good examples of materialism and implications. But to further make it simple to understand, you contrast this to Hermetic philosophy. Which has traditionally been tied with magic and people who practice magic, because there is an essential belief that in Hermetic philosophy, everything is mental, meaning the world is made up of spirit rather than matter. So it's a difference of how we see, what makes up the world and how we can interact in it. Because when the world becomes consciousness, when it becomes spirit, and consciousness is non-local, meaning that it's not trapped inside your body, your own consciousness is not trapped in your head, it means we can travel in ways that we never thought we could before. And in materialism, that simply isn't possible. It's not even part of the conversation.
Yes, which is to draw back to those telescopic images. One of the
Yes.
things that points to travel, as you said, Ingo Swann's work in remote viewing and viewing the moons of Saturn accurately before the launched satellite probe eventually got there. And this is something that is written about at length in Penetration, but was a US government like program employing remote viewers to see what they could find simply by journeying within their imaginal space. That is a really exciting kind of it speaks to the exciting like component of consciousness is not trapped within our own head. And unfortunately, materialism as a philosophy or as a modality of engaging with the world really doesn't know what to do with Giordano Bruno or Ingo Swann or these individuals or these practitioners who aren't famous, like your local apothecary, your local witch, your local card reader, doesn't know what to do with that. And so then the only option is to deny its existence sum total.
Well, I mean, it traps you in the idea of spicy psychology.
Yes.
In the like, well, you just, you took whatever you wanted from the cards, or that was a good guess about what was going to happen in the future, or that spell for manifestation. It just worked because you believed it might, and then you kept an eye out for the opportunities and you stuck with it. It denies the things that, it denies an animist perspective. It denies the kind of essential magicness of magic.
Yes. And I do want to add, I'm going to try and put them in the group as soon as I can find them. I need to do scans of them. But I have a collection of images of Ingo Swann's remote viewing of the moons of Saturn compared with the actual images taken of the moons of Saturn. And then also Uri Geller's remote viewing of items in an envelope and what those items in the envelope actually were. And when you see those images compared with each other, it becomes very difficult to imagine a world in which this is, seeing what you want to see or looking for an opportunity where that is then expressed like a materialist kind of critique of astrology. Like these readings fit everyone.
Yeah.
Yeah. Ooh, so much there. There may be a class necessary on exploring materialist when those do occur, right, as witches, and how to move through them. What are the arguments? What are the thought experiments, right? Because there are a lot of people that will minimize the magic, right, or minimize the enchantment, which I think goes to the next slide perfectly. But it is this, right, and especially when you're doing magical workings and things are not working, how do you then be like, oh no, materialist belief systems, right? And be like, wait, no, I need to go back to the magic. I need to look at all of these aspects. It's not just like during a manifestation ritual, if we're going to go on that route.
Yes.
It's like, oh, well, I want this amount of money by this amount of date, or I want this new job by this date, and something else occurs. And you're like, oh, which is why Kat's comment of, oh, well, magic is all about sidesteps. It's all like openness to the various different energies, entities, consciousness of the universe, consciousness of different plants, water all around us, that when we connect back into that, and that I think is really the practice of magic, like staying in that, we start seeing the enchantment, and it becomes easier to then not engage, right, in conversations that are like, oh, well, arguing with Neil deGrasse Tyson's not going to lead me anywhere.
Exactly.
Right?
And I think Jen says in the chat, I'd like to explore the space where they overlap in the Venn, because there is some overlap or space for overlap. And that space for overlap is, I think, most clearly identified in concept or discussion around like medicinal practice. Connor Habib has a great story. If you're not familiar with Connor Habib, definitely check out his podcast, Against Everything with Connor Habib. It's excellent. He has a really good podcast about his mother's diagnosis with cancer and his diagnosis with cancer, and their unique exploration of treatment modalities between the two of them. For Connor, his experience was simply to say, well, I believe in this new thought stuff, and I'm just going to say I don't have cancer. And he just did that. And it turns out his cancer went away. His mother said the first time she had cancer that she was going to explore it in an allopathic way and do, like, chemotherapy, radiation. There was success there. And the second time she was diagnosed with cancer, she decided that she was going to go entirely holistic, and ultimately she passed away. And Connor had a real reckoning with that because of his experience with that diagnosis and the way in which he engaged with, a treatment modality, one of which was decidedly non-materialist. His takeaway was that both forms of treatment are in some ways an enchantment. The act of treatment was the thing which was being the thing which was being sought. And Isabel, I don't want to put you on the spot, but as someone who is an advocate for both allopathic and holistic medicine, if you ever want to speak to that, I think you have a probably even clearer idea of the Venn beyond just two disparate experiences of one individual and then their relations experience.
Well, I definitely dropped that podcast in the Great Hall because I think it speaks to everything that we're discussing right now. And this is where thought, like our individual collective thoughts, going back to our what was the word that I used earlier? I don't know, thought constellations. Not to use internal family systems therapy, but definitely related to the individual's path, right? Of he decided, okay, I'm gonna try out the new thought stuff, and then he goes in for the scan and it's negative, like all clear. And then his mom went in a different way. Like this is why I love astrology so much. The deeper you go, the more individual somebody's path is and what they need to receive. Not that I ever wish upon anyone illness, right? Mm-hmm. Like, because I also had my diagnosis and moved through it. And I mean, it was the worst and best gift for me when I had that, and I'm receiving something that right, the universe was already telling me, magical workings that I was doing in the past were already telling me, but I wasn't listening or I was resistant to, and that allowed me then to receive what I needed to for my previous magical workings, right? Which was rest, which was space, which was trust in the universe, trust in the things around me, rather than, okay, go materialism, here's the data, here's what I got to do, here's brass tacks, right? So to compare one person's journey and one, like, why did it work for him and not for her? There are so many like individual factors. And this is the other thing too with timelines of people. I'm just very mindful of how to word this so it doesn't sound like, oh, okay, when it's your time, it's your time.
Right.
But but there is this working with people as a death doula, you kind of know, this again goes into the supraconscious. This goes into the enchantments and magical workings of things that you just know and cannot be explained, right? And the materialist conversation, it has no backing in that, right? It's the more mystical experience. I'm currently reading Barbara Ehrenreich's Living with a Wild God. And she's, right, an atheist, grown up atheist, and having a mystical experience, just like, what the heck is this? Right? And it's that exploration. So that the individual, this is why I think solitary witchcraft and having a coven is so important, is you're going into the workings and then you're coming back into your coven and sharing what is working, what is not working, like how we have our coven meetings, and exploring that and being like, oh, I'm frustrated with this working, or this is not, I read this book and it's not, be like, oh, wait, let me have some mirrors, from the
Mm.
outside of other people that are in this conversation, right? Him and his mom were in that conversation together.
Mm.
And it's going to be different for everybody. And this is why using your grimoire Book of Shadows like a scientific method, right? If we're going to use materialism, like using it in
Bullet
that
journal.
way. Yeah, your bullet
Yes.
journal, your Book of Shadows, your grimoire, like having that data, but also allowing the space for that surrender, that co-creation with deities, with demons, with God, with whoever it is that you're working with, right?
Mhm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I think that is kind of you don't have to live in one philosophy always. And I think there's actually good reason why you should not.
Yeah.
But rather than trying to find where they overlap, just
Yes.
you as the observer, as the controller of these things, in many ways, you can switch between them, and you should.
And where they instruct each other, because I do think there's a space for, you know, a mysticism, a magic to instruct materialism, as we've discussed, like what materialism cannot do. But materialism can instruct your magical workings. And the thing that pings into my brain is this idea around like reality shifting to Hogwarts. Like, materialism is a really good antidote to that, because we can use it to say, well, I did not actually go to Hogwarts. This has no net benefit on my life. This is likely just disassociation. And maybe it speaks to something greater in my life, of an unhappiness, of
Maybe not just
something that needs to be resolved.
But it's also disassociation.
Exactly. And so the two can be used at at a kind of at an angle to each other, to prod each other into more effective ways of being.
I'm looking for a shape metaphor here.
Yeah.
We'll make it go.
Yes. So how then do we find enchantment? Because that's kind of what we've been building to over this whole evening. And obviously within a magical modality and magical framework, we talk a lot about enchantment. And it's something that I think many of us in this group are working towards, and maybe even have discovered. But engaging with magic as a set of tools for relating to the world on a different level, and allowing magic to bring us into deeper connection with the spiritual, material, and mundane, the natural and the man-made, the self and the other. Again, this is living in a world and finding the unique solves for the situation at hand. Alan Moore has a great quote that I refer to pretty consistently. That is, if you are sitting to do a magical working to close the door across the room from you, it's way easier just to stand up and go and close the door than trying to summon a demon to do it for you. Understanding what we're seeking and what enchantment we hope to find by opening or closing that door allows us to do it with more efficiency. Are we looking to close the door simply because we want to prove our magical might, or have something happen, or prove magic in our own minds? Or are we just wanting the door closed? Like, what is the efficiency? What is the goal that we're trying to bring into being?
I think that goes into that recent post that you made, Kat, about what is the actual desire, right? And why I harp on about the oud process so much, like your object of desire, because you say you want this, and then you dig a little deeper and you're like, oh, actually, I want the qualities of what this desire may bring me. And then connecting with those qualities on a regular basis, because if anything, what we realize is, oh, I haven't even practiced these qualities yet. How can I even receive them so it doesn't shock my nervous system? Because we may receive something and then you're like, oh my God, I can't believe all these other byproducts of this desire, right? And like, oh, I'm unworthy. I didn't think that I could receive this. Like, oh no, I'm going to shut it down, right? So that's where the magical workings, I think, can come through, where that becomes an efficient process in the working, where we can close the door. Like, do we want to close the door, or is there a draft? Right.
Yeah. So then it becomes like these tools, which we can call mundane, but extremely useful, but not spells, in many ways. Object of desire, exercise, and kind of a journaling around resistance, they become a much more direct way of getting at what manifestation techniques actually end up doing, which is revealing those things to you by, either not giving what you want, or giving you a piece and saying, you are at cross purposes on this other piece.
Yeah.
And it's kind of like you can use magic in a roundabout way, or you can, use the more mundane techniques, the more materialist techniques, to get at what magic would gain you as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think when we're talking about like a synthesis of the two and finding enchantment, like the purpose of the magician or the occultist, or definitely the purpose of the witch / healer in a kind of archetypal or historical framework, is to benefit a community they're a part of, whether that's directly through healing or through ritual workings or through, information gathering, divination, whatever that may be. I think often a lot about like weather workings in this framework, and the idea of like, okay, a materialist framework of, making sure you have a healthy crop is an irrigation system. That's great. Use the irrigation system. Like, don't say I'm not going to use an irrigation system and instead just do ritual workings to cause rain, or build orgone cannons and hope that that causes it to rain. However, when there's a drought and the irrigation systems have failed, definitely break out the orgone cannons, definitely do the ritual workings to call upon the dragon spirits to bring rain. That's like the both and, the 1-2 punch. And then even add the animism, that spiritual mode of being, the animism of like, why are we having the droughts in the first place? Let's talk with some of these spirits of the water, spirits of the plants, and figure out what's going on here.
Yeah.
That's that total synthesis that means we have a good crop yield, right?
Yeah. And sometimes you can look at them to teach you how they manage through a drought.
Yeah.
Yes.
So,
and it may be interesting that, not to add another screw to the whole mix, but it may be that drought was necessary for that year because of the soil and the regeneration of that crop. And you're like, wait, what? And that was new information gathered from the plants, right?
Yes.
Yes.
This begins to really reframe too the ways materialism will tell us how to think about certain things happening environmentally. When we talk about the idea of environmentalism and what is the environment, the idea of the environment being outside of us, a closed system that is perfect, that we can only destroy. I think about this a lot with the idea of like native plants and species. And I cringe every time on Facebook when I see well-meaning posts from individuals saying like, this is a non-native bug, kill it. Because if you look at the actual data of like where non-native species flourish, it's in places where the native species have been dwindling for decades, if not 100 years, due to industrialization, due to urban development, due to whatever, pollution. And that influx of the quote unquote non-native species does actually provide greater biodiversity in the space. Instead, it's this idea of like a materialism, like a pristine nature that we can preserve by eradicating the other. There's nuance here. There are, things that require greater conversation. However, that kind of holistic approach of, well, what does the natural environment need? Like, is there this influx of non-native species because they're overwhelming the ecosystem and causing it to collapse? Or are they filling a need that keeps us alive? I specifically think here about the overwhelm of lanternflies in Pennsylvania. Anyone who's familiar with Pennsylvania or with the lantern bug, lantern bugs are the current public enemy #1 of like the environmental materialist framework. And yet these lantern bugs, what's beginning to be found is that they're doing a great deal of the pollinating work that hasn't been done since some of the biodiversity fall off of the native bugs, plants, species that used to inhabit the area. So they're not useless, as people were claiming when they first came. They're serving a function. This is that kind of like the greater picture that we're looking at here.
Yeah.
And final piece around like just looking at mainstream magic,
Yeah.
the recommendation we have is to embrace not just what is popular, but also what is subversive, not only to like the world, but also to you in particular.
Yes.
Like what challenges you? What do you maybe need to face?
Yes.
And what is supremely different? Because that kind of challenge, you know, brings you to growth, and it might bring you to a new state of being that is better.
Yes.
And there is power in perspective shifting because it brings the awareness of more freedom of choice for you and a creativity of how we express ourselves.
Yes. As growing up a good Protestant boy, the magical awakening for myself was the interfacing with the saints. Notably for me, the saints that did not actually exist, which really, like that frame shift, that, you know, connection with something that was outside my previous mode of belief and understanding opened up my whole like cosmology to a greater spiritual world. However, as a good Protestant boy growing up in Pennsylvania, I was pretty sure Catholics were evil and going to hell. That's just, you know, the framework of being raised Baptist. So confronting things which scare us, or things that maybe feel like they're outside the mode of what we're comfortable interacting with, especially in magic, gives us that alternative perspective on our own workings. Doesn't mean you have to go out and become the LaVeyan Satanist, or go out and become the
unless you are called, of course.
Unless you're called, of course. However, it will, that idea of like a LaVeyan Satanism and New Thought will totally change the way in which you engage with Israel Regardie and the Tree of Life.
So buy all those tarot decks.
Yeah, buy all the tarot decks, get in all the arguments on witch talk, hex the moon.
No. Sorry.
Argue with Neil deGrasse Tyson on Twitter.
Yes. Any final thoughts, Isabel or Kat?
This is such a great conversation, and I love the chat that's coming through. And I know it was a bit ago when Danny was talking about shadow work, because I know that's a big part of her practice. Of, do therapists have what's it called, the dibs
Yes.
on shadow work? And actually, I was talking to a client of mine that's going through my facilitator training, and we were talking about the distinctions of therapists, facilitators, and coaches, and having a Venn diagram kind of all three. And I like to think of therapists as working through the past, and also with clinical disorders of, right, we cannot function, so low functioning kind of ability, right? And there are going to be seasons of life where everyone's there and we need some extra support. And also therapists can support with high functioning things too. However, we digging deep in that. And then coaches, thinking about, if we're going to think of the most easy example of like a fitness coach, right? Like they're going to push you, they're going to bring you through, like despite whatever, like, come on, we're coming through it, right? Yep. And they'll recognize when the internal things are coming through for people, that they're like, okay, let's work through this, let's make some space, and then we're going to keep moving forward, right? So I think of therapy as kind of pulling from the past, coaches pulling into the future. And I think facilitators are that middle liminal space where they're allowing people, right, to process, to integrate, to walk alongside them and give them resources and tools to come to their conclusions. Yes, Jen, it takes a village, a whole care team. Big, you know, I always talk about like who's on your care team,
Exactly.
You know, right? It's not a solo journey, and we all know as facilitators, teachers, community workers, witches, that we all need those care teams in that way, and our places are safe places where we can go to and be like, I need to just vent, or this working is not doing well, or I felt too pushed, but I came through it, but I have some thoughts about it, right? Like the ethics of things. So having these spaces is super important. I hope that helps Danny with kind of this Venn diagram of facilitators, therapists, shadow workers. I don't think therapists have dibs on the shadow work. I think it's fabulous to be working alongside one, right? Like the care team, that's always going to be my response with the full picture of things.
Yeah, absolutely. That is some of the best magic, I think. And one of the things I will go to my grave defending the grade systems for, the Golden Dawn saying, yeah, do the magic, but also, you know, get a therapist. It's important work. And that processing is not simply just like a therapeutic one. This is a conversation I've had with another practitioner around like medicine stuff. Like, you know, what does it mean to go to your, you know, in-network doctor, but also see your herbalist down the street? And see your acupuncturist or your Reiki healer. Like they can be integrated.
And when it comes to like having a monopoly in a certain service, like you can question that by saying like, well, what kind of therapist do I have to see?
Yes.
Right.
Are they a physical therapist? Are they a hypnotherapist? Or are they like
cognitive behavioral, Jungian
yeah.
analysis?
Interest, like, I mean, we're all working through this together. So pick one that is aligned with you and your philosophy and can support you and hold your hand through this.
Yeah.
Right.
Maybe it's not a therapist.
Yeah, maybe it's a magician.
Yeah. And that's the other thing too, of like, there's no shame in shopping around, right? Of like one that's aligned. Because I have clients that they've seen therapists that they didn't know anything about magical workings or a certain cultural framework where folk magic was so integral and just a normal part of everyday life. And then we'll talk and they're like, oh, I feel so relieved. I don't have to explain myself, right?
Yeah.
So that is because it's such a part of their own healing work. And then there are going to be therapists that are like, oh, or clients that I'm working with, and it's something out of my scope of practice, right? Or something that I deem to believe it as a clinical issue that I'm like, oh, I have somebody else that's licensed, right? And I can refer you to them. So, but care team always.
Because the breakthroughs come from both sometimes like the institutional knowledge, but then also the outside of the box thinking. I think most strongly here always of like, again, personal hero, but I think about Jack Parsons. Like up until Parsons and JPL Rocket Labs, like everyone was more or less settled science that you could not go to the moon because you could not create a rocket with enough lift to get you there. And it took an occultist doing a Babylon working to figure out, oh, we can do solid state, like we can get to the moon. And after that, that solid state rocket is then plugged into conventional aerodynamics and like trajectory of science and ballistics, and boom, man is on the moon within 10 years. It is the need of the understood and orthodoxy and the need of the out of the box batshit thinking that can really come from the metaphysical.
Yes.
We need the moon card of lunacy and the Hierophant's grounding with maybe some hangman in the middle.
Yes.
Also, Russia got to space first. So
this is also true. But not to the moon.
I know.
Although that's
people in the United States are just like the moon.
Coming up as a precursor. We'll just give a little peek to some of the topics we'll be discussing in fall semester.
We need to wrap up this.
And then we will let everyone go.